It began with a voice slicing through the room like a blade. Jasmine Crockett had barely leaned into the microphone, her words forming with steady rhythm, when Stephen Miller's interruption came crashing down over her. One voice trying to explain, another determined to drown it out. The chamber, already tense, snapped into a new level of friction. Once, he cut her off with a raised tone, an impatient gesture, a flash of disdain. Crockett tried to push forward, measured and composed, her eyes narrowing just enough to betray the insult, but before her thought could even land, he lunged in again. Twice. The sound of his interruption reverberated louder than the arguments themselves. By the third time, the rhythm was unmistakable. Miller wasn't debating, he was silencing. Each interjection rolled like a thunderclap, calculated, dismissive. The kind of interruption meant not just to question words, but to question worth. Crockett's jaw tightened. The people watching leaned forward. What they saw wasn't just disagreement, it was dismissal. 4 times. 5 times. 6. Every attempt she made to regain the floor was met with another crash of arrogance. Miller's voice pushing past hers, his posture soaking in the entitlement of a man who thought control was his by default. Gasps and murmurs rippled in the room, staffers shifting uncomfortably, cameras catching every flinch, every glare, every silent recognition that something ugly was unfolding in front of them. And yet, through it all, Jasmine Crockett refused to break. She held her ground, her voice steady even as it was shoved aside. With each interruption, the anticipation grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the crack in. Miller's armor. Viewers watching from home felt their own fists clench. They knew exactly what they were seeing, the all-too-familiar performance of power, arrogance trying to erase dignity. But Crockett was not a woman easily erased. And when Miller lunged into his 7th interruption, when he assumed yet again that his volume would win, she delivered a line so sharp, so perfectly placed, that the entire chamber fell silent. Phones lit up. Clips began flying. The headlines would come later. In that instant, though, the silence told the story. Arrogance had finally met its match. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, we have to rewind. To grasp why this clash electrified so many, you have to see the battlefield where it unfolded. The committee room wasn't just another sterile chamber of government, it was a stage, heavy with history, power, and expectation. Ornate wood paneling framed rows of lawmakers and witnesses, the air dense with the weight of decisions that ripple far beyond Washington. But in this room, it wasn't only policy at stake. It was dignity, it was identity, and it was the unspoken. War over who gets to be heard in America. Stephen Miller entered the hearing with the swagger of a man who had long mastered the art of dominating the air around him. For years, he had built his reputation on sharp elbows and sharper rhetoric, reveling in confrontation. This was a man who thrived on taking up space, whether in meetings, on cable television, or in the national consciousness. His interruptions were not accidents. They were the performance of entitlement, a show of control meant to remind everyone in earshot who believed he held the microphone by birthright. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, no stranger to tension, no stranger to having her voice underestimated. She carried herself with a calm gravity, the kind born of battles far greater than this one hearing. For her, every word wasn't just a statement. It was a stand for those who had been silenced before. And so when she opened her mouth to speak, it wasn't merely about policy. It was about presence, about carving out space in a system where people like her were often told to wait their turn, or worse, to stay quiet altogether. The room's atmosphere made every second feel heavier. Staffers scribbled notes, cameras zoomed in, reporters exchanged glances. The interruptions began to feel less like debate and more like a clash of symbols. Miller representing the old guard of arrogance and interruption. Crockett embodying resilience, patience, and the determination to be heard no matter how many walls were built in her way. And outside the chamber, millions of people who would later watch this exchange knew exactly why it mattered. For every immigrant who had been cut off mid-story, for every woman who had been talked over in a boardroom, For every black voice dismissed before the sentence was finished, this moment became a mirror. It wasn't just about two people in Washington. It was about every silencing that had ever happened, replayed in real time, daring the audience to feel it in their bones. And that's why the tension grew with each interruption. It wasn't only about Crockett and Miller. It was about the audience at home, watching with clenched jaws, whispering at their screens, "Let her speak." It was about that gnawing fear that arrogance might win yet again. And it was about the deep, electric hope that maybe, just maybe, this time it wouldn't. By the time the sixth interruption landed, the stakes had risen far beyond the committee's agenda. The silence after each clash felt longer, the looks around the chamber sharper, and viewers could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Because what came next would not only flip the power dynamic in that room, it would ignite a reaction across the country, leaving even seasoned political observers stunned. What happens next changes everything. To understand why Stephen Miller's interruptions carried such venom, you have to understand the man behind the voice. Miller wasn't just another political aide who faded into the background of Washington's endless shuffle. He was a brand unto himself, a man who built his career not on compromise, but on confrontation. For years, he thrived in the shadows of power, whispering in the ears of presidents, senators, and media firebrands. He didn't just play politics, he weaponized it. From his earliest days, Miller cultivated an identity built on defiance. In high school, he was the kid railing against multicultural assemblies, sneering at the very idea of inclusion. At Duke University, he became known for his columns laced with derision toward immigrants and minorities. A provocateur who treated bigotry as performance art, he sought out cameras, microphones, any audience that would allow him to sharpen his blade of division. By the time he entered Washington, Miller had already mastered the role he would play, the agitator who thrives on dominance. As a senior advisor in the Trump White House, he was the architect behind some of the most polarizing policies in recent memory: the travel ban, family separations, hardline immigration crackdowns that sent shockwaves through immigrant communities. His fingerprints were everywhere, on every memo designed to shrink the tent of America rather than expand it. To his critics, Miller wasn't simply a policymaker. He was an antagonist in the truest sense, someone who thrived on the anguish his decisions caused. And what made him so dangerous in public forums was not just his ideology, but his delivery. Miller didn't debate in the traditional sense, he steamrolled. He interrupted. He treated silence as weakness, pausing only to reload his certainty before unleashing it again. His confidence often bordered on arrogance, his tone dripping with condescension toward anyone who dared to push back. To him, conversation wasn't about truth. It was about dominance. So when he walked into the chamber that day, the script seemed predictable. Interrupt, overwhelm, control. He had done it countless times before, and it had worked. Political opponents often crumbled under the sheer force of his interruptions, their sentences lost to the fog of his booming certainty. For Miller, this wasn't rudeness. It was strategy. If he could keep you off balance long enough, you'd never land your blow. But here's the fatal flaw in Miller's performance. Arrogance breeds blindness. He mistook his ability to bulldoze for invincibility. He assumed that his pattern of dismissiveness would silence any challenger, and in that assumption lay the seeds of his undoing. Because on this day, he wasn't facing someone who rattled easily. He was facing Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had been underestimated before and who knew how to turn dismissal into fuel. Still, Miller pressed forward, the arrogance practically dripping from every interruption. He leaned forward in his chair, his hand slicing the air with impatience, his voice cutting in before Crockett could string her arguments together. It wasn't enough for him to disagree. He had to dominate, to erase. And to the audience watching, it was painfully familiar. The entitled figure who speaks as though others don't deserve the floor, who equates loudness with rightness. For many viewers, Miller wasn't just Stephen Miller in that moment. He was the face of every boss who talked over them, every teacher who dismissed their question, Every politician who acted as though certain voices didn't matter, his interruptions, became symbolic, a performance of privilege masquerading as debate. And while he reveled in his control, the tension in the room grew thicker with every interjection. Because here's the truth about arrogance: it blinds you to the storm that's building right in front of you. Miller didn't notice the steel forming in Crockett's eyes, didn't sense the patience of someone waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He thought he was silencing her. In reality, he was setting the stage for one of the sharpest takedowns the chamber had seen in years. And when that moment came, his years of dominance would be undone in a matter of seconds. But Miller wasn't ready for that. He never saw it coming. Because across from him sat a woman with her own story, a story of resilience, of battles survived, of a voice sharpened not in privilege but in struggle. And her backstory would explain exactly why she couldn't be broken by 6 interruptions, and why the 7th would make history. To understand why Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch under Stephen Miller's barrage, you have to know where she came from and why interruptions like his were nothing new in her life. Crockett's story begins far from the corridors of Washington power. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, she was the kind of young woman who saw injustice not as a news headline, but as a daily reality. The classrooms weren't always equal. The neighborhoods weren't always safe, and the opportunities weren't always handed out with fairness. Yet even in that environment, she found a fire inside herself, a stubborn insistence that if systems were stacked against her, she would find a way to climb them anyway. Her early years in law school revealed the same grit. While others saw courtroom battles as abstract exercises, Crockett saw them as lifelines. She chose criminal defense not because it was glamorous, but because it was gritty. She stood shoulder to shoulder with clients who didn't have anyone else willing to stand for them. She learned the rhythm of being talked over by judges, prosecutors, even colleagues who underestimated her because she was young, because she was a woman, because she was black. Every interruption became practice. Every dismissal became fuel. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't for prestige. It was because she knew the stories of her clients, their struggles, their silences needed a bigger microphone. She ran not to join the machine but to challenge it. And when voters put her in office, she carried with her not just policy positions, but the weight of every silenced voice she had ever defended. That weight forged a presence that couldn't be rattled by a man like Miller, no matter how many times he lunged across her sentences. What made Crockett extraordinary in that chamber was not just her resume, but her lived experience. She embodied the resilience of women who had been told to wait their turn, the pride of black communities who knew what it meant to be erased and still rise, the dignity of immigrants and working-class families who had been interrupted their entire lives by systems designed to mute them. In Crockett, they saw not just a politician, but a reflection. And Crockett knew that too. She carried herself with the awareness that she wasn't speaking for herself alone. Every time she leaned into a microphone, it was with the knowledge that a girl somewhere watching would see her and believe she too deserved to be heard. That consciousness gave her voice a calm strength that no amount of bluster could shake. So when Miller began his interruptions that day, Crockett didn't panic. She didn't scramble. She absorbed the noise with the patience of someone who had been here before, someone who understood that arrogance always burns itself out. Each time Miller spoke over her, Crockett measured her response, not with rage, but with timing. She let him build the tower of his own arrogance, interruption by interruption, knowing that when she finally struck, it wouldn't matter. Her composure was her weapon. While Miller grew louder, she grew steadier. While he gestured with dismissive impatience, she kept her eyes trained forward, her voice controlled, her expression unbroken. That calm was not weakness. It was power. And the audience watching could feel it. The quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of resilience. The dignity that no interruption could erase. Crockett's backstory explains why the chamber shifted that day. Because when Miller leaned on arrogance, Crockett leaned on authenticity. When he leaned on entitlement, she leaned on earned credibility. And when he assumed he could dominate the floor, she reminded him, and everyone else watching, that voices forged in struggle are not so easily silenced. By the sixth interruption, the stage was set. To Miller, it seemed like just another performance of dominance. But to Crockett, it was the perfect build-up to the moment she had been waiting for. She knew her seventh response would not simply reclaim her voice, it would shatter his. Because in that seventh line, all of her history, the courtroom battles, the political fights, the lived resilience would converge in a single cutting statement. And when she delivered it, the chamber would not only hear her words, they would feel the full force of the story behind them. That's why when the interruptions escalated, Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive them. She transformed them into the very stage for her triumph. And that set the scene for the most dramatic exchange of the day, the moment when Miller's interruptions reached their breaking point, and Crockett's voice rose above it all. The interruptions came like clockwork, predictable yet jarring, each one striking harder than the last. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her tone measured, her eyes locked forward, and then cut. Stephen Miller's voice surged over hers once again, blunt and overbearing, slicing her words mid-thought. The first interruption had seemed rude. The second, deliberate. By the third, the room began to shift. Lawmakers exchanged glances, staffers squirmed in their seats. Cameras swiveled to catch the rising tension. Viewers at home could feel their own frustration tightening like a fist. This wasn't debate anymore, it was dominance theater. Crockett pressed forward, unshaken, her cadence as steady as a heartbeat. But Miller's interruptions multiplied. He leaned back, then forward, his tone sharpened with each interjection as if sheer repetition could erase her argument. 4 times, 5, 6. Every break in her words was another attempt to cut her down, to suggest that her voice did not deserve to finish its own sentence. And with each clash, the stakes climbed higher. This was no longer about the subject on the table. It was about respect itself. In that room, everyone knew they were witnessing something larger than a policy squabble. They were watching arrogance attempt to bulldoze dignity. The air thickened. Crockett's jaw tightened, but her composure never cracked. She did not raise her voice. She did not fold. Instead, she let the interruptions pile up like evidence, a mounting case against Miller's arrogance that the audience themselves were tallying with each impatient cutoff. Every time Miller's voice surged over hers, the viewers' anticipation grew sharper. They weren't just waiting for Crockett to respond, they were aching for it. By the fifth interruption, the tension was unbearable. Phones buzzed in laps, live tweeters already venting outrage in real time. By the sixth, the silence between Miller's words felt electric, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how much longer this performance of arrogance could continue unchecked. And then it came, the seventh attempt. Miller lunged in once more, dismissive and smug, sure of his dominance. But this time, Crockett was ready. Her patience, her resilience, her years of practice in the art of composure had brought her to this exact second. She leaned forward, eyes flashing with unshakable resolve. Her voice, calm but cutting, sliced through the noise with a precision that Miller had not anticipated. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was perfectly timed, perfectly placed, and devastating in its clarity. For the first time, Miller froze. His words faltered, his certainty fractured. The chamber shifted instantly, the silence after her statement louder than any of his interruptions. The balance of power, so lopsided for 6 grating exchanges, had flipped in a single breath. And in that silence, everyone knew Stephen Miller had finally been shut down. But Crockett wasn't just silencing a man in a committee room. She was sending a message, one that would echo far beyond those walls. Because what she said in that seventh line would soon leave the room, explode across screens, and ignite a firestorm Miller never saw coming. The chamber had grown weary of the interruptions, like a drumbeat pounding against patience. 6 times, Stephen Miller had lunged forward with the force of entitlement, his voice pressing down on Jasmine Crockett's every attempt to be heard. 6 times she had allowed him to reveal himself, to show the arrogance, the smug certainty, the disdain that he believed would go unchecked. But on the 7th, everything changed. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his volume, his sharp edges, or his theatrics. Instead, she leaned into the microphone with the calm precision of someone who had been preparing her entire life for this exact moment. Her tone was steady, deliberate, her eyes narrowed but unshaken. She let the pause stretch just long enough for the room to lean forward, long enough for Miller to believe, for one final second, that he had once again succeeded in cutting her off. And then came the line, simple, devastating, delivered with surgical timing. Crockett's words cut through the air like a blade, a statement so sharp and undeniable that Miller's interruptions, once thunderous, collapsed into silence. The chamber froze. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the silence of impact, the collective intake of breath when arrogance is suddenly exposed for what it is. Staffers stopped mid-note, reporters' pens hovered above paper. Cameras zoomed in to capture the exact moment dominance crumbled. Miller's face twitched, his lips parting as if to lunge in again, but nothing came. For the first time all day, his certainty fractured. His eyes darted, his posture shifted. The arrogance that had carried him through 6 smug interruptions evaporated in a single instant. The man who had prided himself on always having the last word was suddenly wordless. And then the ripple began. A muffled chuckle broke the tension. Someone shifted in their chair, shaking their head with disbelief. In the gallery, a few gasps turned into laughter, the kind of laughter not born from humor, but from recognition. Recognition that the imbalance had been corrected, that dignity had seized the floor at last. Phones lit up. Cameras caught Crockett's steady gaze, her composed silence after delivering the blow, her refusal to gloat, her refusal to add anything more. She didn't need to. The line stood on its own. For viewers watching at home, the moment was electric. They knew exactly what they had seen. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reclamation. For 6 rounds, Miller had tried to make her invisible. With one perfectly timed strike, Crockett made herself unforgettable. Social media reacted instantly. Clips of the exchange flew onto timelines, captions screaming with joy, with vindication, with pride. Hashtags bloomed across the digital landscape. One video hit 1 million views before the hearing even adjourned. Commentators replayed the takedown in slow motion, dissecting the pause, the look in her eyes, the stunned stillness that followed. Every frame became part of the legend. And what made it so powerful wasn't just Crockett's words, it was the contrast. Miller had been loud, impatient, brash. Crockett had been calm, patient, precise. His voice tried to erase hers. Her silence erased his. He relied on entitlement. She relied on authenticity. He interrupted. She endured. And then, with one line, she didn't just respond, she ended the game altogether. The mic drop wasn't about volume. It was about dignity. It was about the quiet, immovable strength of someone who had carried entire communities on her back, and knew that truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to land, and land it did. In that moment, Miller was no longer the antagonist controlling the tempo. He was the man who had been silenced by the very person he tried to erase. The audience didn't remember his interruptions. They remembered her line. They remembered the look on his face, the silence that followed, the way power shifted in an instant. The hearing moved on, but no one in that chamber had really moved on. They were still replaying it in their minds, the way Crockett's voice had carved the room open, the way her calm had swallowed Miller's arrogance whole, and outside, the ripple effect only grew. Within hours, late-night comedians were working the moment into their monologues. Journalists were framing it as the 7th strike heard across the country. Activists were sharing it as proof that dignity could still win in a system addicted to arrogance. Ordinary viewers, scrolling on their lunch breaks, were replaying the clip over and over, shaking their heads in disbelief, smiling at the rare sight of entitlement finally getting shut down. For those who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, talked over, or silenced, Crockett's 7th line wasn't just a political exchange. It was personal. It was vindication. It was proof that composure could outlast condescension, that truth could survive interruption, that even in the noisiest room, dignity could still be heard. And for Miller, The man who had built his brand on always controlling the conversation, the damage was permanent. He had underestimated his opponent. He had misread the room. He had mistaken patience for weakness. And in doing so, he had handed Crockett the stage on which she delivered one of the most memorable mic drops of the political season. But as powerful as the moment was inside that room, the real story was just beginning. Because Crockett's words didn't stop at the chamber walls. They spread like wildfire, igniting conversations, debates, celebrations far beyond Washington. And what happened next would leave the entire country in disbelief. The silence in the chamber didn't last long. It never does when a moment like that detonates. What began as stunned stillness cracked into whispers, then gasps, then the faint buzz of cell phones lighting up across the room. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's seventh line was out in the wild. And once it hit the bloodstream of social media, the explosion was unstoppable. On Twitter, hashtags materialized almost instantly. Hashtag seventh time, hashtag Crockett clap back, hashtag Miller shut down. Users replayed the clip in endless loops, highlighting the exact second Miller's face shifted from smug certainty to stunned silence. "I've waited my whole life to see this," one post read, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. "This is for every time a man talked over me in a meeting," another wrote. The comments weren't just celebrating Crockett, they were identifying with her. Her takedown wasn't confined to that chamber. It was shared ownership, a collective exhale of vindication. Instagram Reels added dramatic music under her line, some overlaying slow motion zooms on her face as Miller's expression collapsed. TikTok creators staged reenactments, LIP syncing her words while mocking Miller's interruptions with exaggerated arrogance. Memes spread faster than the news cycle itself. One showed Miller's face edited onto a crumbling statue. Another cast Crockett as a superhero delivering the knockout blow after 6 failed attempts. And then came the voices of validation. Prominent activists amplified the moment as symbolic, a reminder of the resilience of women, of black women in particular, who had endured centuries of silencing and still stood unbroken. Celebrities chimed in, actors, musicians, comedians praising Crockett's poise and precision. Late-night hosts replayed the clip with relish, their monologues reveling in Miller's humiliation. Even political commentators, who rarely agreed on anything, acknowledged the force of what had happened, arrogance meeting its match in a single calm line. But beyond the jokes and applause, there was something deeper unfolding. People weren't just entertained, they were moved. Teachers shared the clip with their students as an example of standing firm under pressure. Parents showed their children, saying, "This is what it looks like when dignity wins." Community leaders used it as a rallying cry, proof that interruptions and dismissals, no matter how relentless, can be overcome with patience and clarity. Meanwhile, Miller's reputation took a bruising blow. For years, he had thrived on being the interrupter, the dominator, the man who could bend a room with his sharpness. Now, he was the man who had been silenced. Clips of his interruptions before the seventh line circulated as well, not as examples of strength, but of pettiness. The narrative flipped. What he had thought was dominance now looked desperate, insecure, pathetic. And Crockett? Her stature soared. Overnight, she became a symbol of composure under fire, a face of unshakable dignity in the face of arrogance. Op-eds praised her as the future of a politics that refuses to bow. Headlines framed her as the new standard for resilience. Her supporters felt vindicated, her detractors rattled, and undecided viewers intrigued by the rare display of authenticity in a chamber so often drowned in noise. The shockwaves weren't just digital. They were emotional, cultural, symbolic. For millions, that seventh line became a shorthand for something larger, the idea that silencing voices, whether in politics, in classrooms, in workplaces, can and will be undone. Crockett had given form to a universal experience, and in doing so, she had created a moment that transcended politics. But while the memes and trending hashtags captured the humor, what lingered was the meaning. People weren't just laughing at Miller, they were celebrating Crockett. They were celebrating resilience, representation, the power of refusing to be erased. And in that celebration, a new kind of momentum began to build. Because beyond the spectacle, beyond the social media storm, lay the deeper question. What does it mean when one voice refuses to be silenced and millions rally behind it? The answer to that question would define the resolution of this story. And it would reveal why Crockett's victory was never just about a single exchange in a hearing room. It was about a universal truth waiting to be heard. When the laughter faded, when the hashtags slowed, when the memes became part of the digital background noise, what remained was the truth at the core of Jasmine Crockett's moment. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. For 6 interruptions, Miller had embodied the old politics of dominance, the belief that power is proven through volume, that credibility comes from drowning others out. But Crockett's 7th line revealed something entirely different. That strength is not about shouting the loudest, but about standing firm until the noise collapses under its own weight. Her calm wasn't passive, it was revolutionary. In a space where women, especially women of color, are too often erased mid-sentence, Crockett's composure was a declaration that she would not be silenced. And in that declaration, millions of people watching found themselves reflected. Workers remembered the boardroom where their ideas were stolen. Students recalled the classroom where their voices were dismissed. Immigrant families thought of the countless times they had been told their stories didn't matter. Crockett's voice carried them all. The moral wasn't abstract. It was vivid, undeniable. Arrogance burns bright but burns out quickly. Dignity endures. Entitlement interrupts, but truth waits its turn, and when it finally speaks, it cannot be ignored. In that sense, Crockett's 7th line was more than a political mic drop. It was a cultural reckoning. It reminded America that interruption is not the same as authority, and that silencing does not equal victory. True power lies in the ability to hold one's ground, to wait for the right moment, and to let authenticity do what arrogance never can, inspire. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the trending tags fade, because Crockett didn't just win an argument. She gave language to a universal struggle. She proved that for every voice that has been interrupted, there is a comeback waiting. For every attempt to erase dignity, there is a response that can restore it. Her story in that chamber became a lesson beyond politics. It was about justice, about respect, about the simple but profound truth that no one should ever be denied their voice. In a world where so many are talked over, the reminder that silence can be broken, and broken with grace, was both empowering and essential. And so the legacy of that 7th line isn't just Miller's humiliation, it is Crockett's triumph. It is the affirmation that dignity, once spoken, cannot be erased. It is the quiet but resounding lesson that America, at its best, listens, not to the loudest interrupter, but to the clearest truth. And that truth, delivered in a single line, is why this confrontation will echo for years to come. 6 times Stephen Miller interrupted. 6 times he tried to cut down a voice that refused to break. But on the 7th, Jasmine Crockett delivered a line that shifted the air, silenced the arrogance, and reminded everyone in that chamber and everyone watching that dignity can never be erased. This was never just about one hearing, or even about one man's arrogance. It was about the universal struggle for respect. It was about every person who has been told their words don't matter, every immigrant who has been talked over, every woman whose ideas were stolen, every black voice that was silenced mid-sentence. Crockett didn't just speak for herself. That day, she spoke for all of them. And that's why her 7th line reverberated far beyond Washington. It wasn't a headline, it was a symbol, a moment of clarity in a noisy world. A reminder that arrogance crumbles when met with patience. And that truth, calm, steady, undeniable, will always find its way through. So if you felt something watching that moment, you're not alone. Millions did. They shared it, celebrated it, and carried it as proof that composure can be louder than interruption, and that justice is not just a word, but an act of standing firm. Now it's your turn. Share this story. Carry it forward. Let it remind you that your voice matters, no matter how many times it's cut off. Subscribe, join this community, and be part of amplifying dignity over arrogance, truth over noise. because Stephen Miller interrupted her 6 times. But Jasmine Crockett's 7th line shut him down, and in doing so, she spoke for an America still waiting to be heard.